Hello, welcome back to Smiley's After Hours. This is part 2 of my series on Kadaspala. This one's actually titled Kadaspala on Art, which is the most vague, broad term I could apply to this guy, but here we are. Obviously, it's not going to encompass everything. It's chiefly centered on Chapter 6. There's way more in the next 2 chapters we'll be discussing next time. But for the time being, I want to center on more the art side of Kadaspala rather than anything more broad. So, this particular part is centered much more on the genius portion of the title, as I believe the reflections of Kadaspala's art and art as a whole are very reminiscent of similar thoughts found in other media, from music to cinema to other older books, and are quite telling, I believe, of Erikson's approach to his art, at least in the broader sense, as we'll soon see. The tragedy, of course, arises from Kadaspala being heated, but that's par for the course. Without any further ado, let us get into it. So, Chapter 1, I have titled Art is War, which is one of Kadaspala's more famous quotes from this book. Let us begin by setting the scene. As discussed in the last episode, which seems like ages ago by now, Kadaspala has been commissioned to paint the portrait of Vatho Ursander, which is hardly a surprise given the circumstances. Ursander is a decorated war hero, and Kadaspala is often brought up as the best portrait artist of this generation. Among other things, he has also painted Draconis, which goals. But hey, he's painted a lot of people. What also is scantily surprising is the political intent behind the commission. The rumors of civil war have been circulating long enough, and at the head of Kurulgalin's biggest army, Ursander has the most leverage of most actors, save for Mother Dark herself, to tilt the scales in either party's favor. Where does that leave us and our artist subject? Torn between a bleak political outlook, one which the portrait Kadaspala is presently composing would directly or indirectly aid in bringing about, and the artist's personal outlook on the matter, which runs contrary to all that the portrait represents. And in this contrast, conflict arises, and from conflict, drama, and from drama, tragedy. Or something like that. What I would like to highlight is the liminal space that Kadaspala's thought process occupies. He is fully and entirely aware of the political undertone of his art, and yet commits himself to painting this particular portrait regardless, even though he himself says that he has turned down 100 commissions. This is not a decision you reach easily. He himself, is battered by this. There's a measure of cognitive dissonance to Kadaspala's thoughts. He confesses to being exhausted and dissatisfied with his own work, and is it any surprise when the very work he's attempting to paint goes against all that he stands for? Which raises the very interesting question of how an artist would go about representing stances or notions that they fundamentally disagree with, be that in prose, or in painting, or in sculpting, or poetry, or what have you. How can an artist be truthful to themselves when they must perforce wear masks, as Gallan would put it, while simultaneously delivering a piece that is indeed capable of proving the point being made? Very good question. I don't actually have an answer to that. I have asked Steve repeatedly, and one of his more common answers is you have to embody the character you're writing at any given time, or painting, or what have you. And so, in a certain sense, that kind of bypasses the issue of, you disagree with them, but you have to play along. So, in that kind of sense, I guess it kind of bypasses the issue. But more broadly, how do you portray something like that? Especially in painting, when, in this case, the fate of an entire realm is on the line. Often, you hear about the need to separate the artist from the art, how an artist's personality and real-life acts should not affect the quality of the work, which is almost universally used in a negative sense, which somewhat diminishes the truism, but I'm not going to get into the debate right now. That's all well and good, but one angle that is often not explored is how an artist can separate themselves from their art, as I've mentioned, more so in literary and visual mediums, i.e. books and cinema, and more pertinently to our discussion, how portrait artists can accurately paint a subject while simultaneously delivering commentary via their art that is picked up by the spectator. Kadaspala parallels the struggle with war and battle, a war whose objective is to force recognition unto the audience of the painter's intentions behind the piece, of their inner landscape and how it reflects on the canvas, and how, in turn, it will reflect upon them. In all, Kadaspala points out, an impossible objective. Every victory gained is not but surrender. And thus, tragedy arises. that concludes Chapter 1. Chapter 2, I have named Gallan's self-insert, because that's what Kadaspala basically is in this chapter. Keen-eyed readers may notice that Kadaspala evokes Gallan quite often in his internal monologues. I have admittedly not counted, but within the diegesis, the two are ostensibly close friends, even though Gallan never technically appears in character within the narrative. And Kadaspala often thinks about Gallan's reactions to the thoughts he has, all while being narrated by Gallan. This is a bit confusing, I know. Bear with me. Throughout the series, I have made a point that Kadaspala is special in that he often is the first to tackle a certain theme that gets brought up time and again throughout Kharkanas. And I think herein lies the reason for that. Kadaspala is a very easy mask to don, a very convenient vessel for thematic exploration for Gallan. Therefore, Gallan often slips into the guise of Kadaspala to bring about certain themes. The other core vessel for thematic exploration in Forge of Darkness, who in my opinion is Arathan, is not as convenient, since Arathan must perforce learn about a certain situation before processing and expressing an opinion. Therefore, Arathan finds himself asking the questions, hearing answers before delivering his own answer, which is often contrary to the answer he heard and arguably more correct. Basically, he has to formulate his opinion after the fact. Kadaspala already has formulated opinions a priori, which helps a lot, because you don't need to rehash the same point 30 times before you get to the point that you want to make. So, he is often the one providing the answers to others' questions, with those questions arising either from characters within the work, like with Rusander and Kadaspala's thoughts on justice that we tackled last episode, or from the narrator obliquely setting those questions to the character by painting a certain landscape. Which is something we'll get to extensively when we talk about Kadaspala's thoughts on faith in Chapter 13. Indeed, Gallan's thoughts on art, more so on the art of poetry, can be paralleled quite accurately with Kadaspala's own. After all, in the first episode, I made the claim that Kadaspala's tragedy arises from the fact that nobody, ever, heeds artists, philosophers, and poets, and Gallan has an axe to grind, with Kadaspala Enes as his grindstone. Which brings us to our next point, namely, what Kadaspala imprints on his art, and how, since art is war, his art reflects reality. Now, before we get to that, I want to bring up a few things about Gallan, which I thought you might find interesting. He makes it extremely clear from the get-go, from the prelude of Forge of Darkness, that he has an axe to grind, as aforementioned. He is very opinionated. He has very strong opinions on both characters and on events. I have made the case in the past that, like, Kharkanas in general is Gallan's cautionary tale. So in that sense, obviously Gallan would imprint himself on his work, but then we also have Fisher as a lens through which to view Kharkanas, because he also has opinions, which we are not as privy to. We can kind of guess, because he made a poem named Anomandaris, and we can kind of guess, what he thinks, and what he believes, and how he feels. But in general, the lenses of artists through which we view Kharkanas is very interesting. We have Stephen Erickson, who is a writer, an author. We have Fisher, who is a poet within the diegesis. We have Gallan, who is another poet that may or may not exist within the diegesis. And we have Kadaspala, who is a fourth artist. And so, the discussion of art is filtered through 4 different lenses. What Kadaspala thinks, what Gallan thinks, what Fisher thinks, and what Steve wants to show. And beyond the fact that, Kadaspala views this as a war, like Gallan would say probably the same, right? Because he's trying to make a point. Especially in Full of Light, much more so in Full of Light than in this book, he's trying to make a point. He even starts off with, bitching about poets who lust for blood, and how they have the same depth as a puddle of paste in the ground or something. Fisher is more laid back. Fisher generally, from what we know from his poems, not poets, what we know from Fisher's poems, and his interactions with, Duiker, is that he's more laid back and more appreciative of the audience. He wants to deliver a story that the audience can appreciate rather than tell his story and the audience be damned. There is that, I don't remember exactly. There was a poem about, every tale's a gift. It's in All the Hounds, some epigraph. I don't remember exactly which. And, Kadaspala has a very similar monologue in Chapter 13, which I can't get into right now because we'll get there later. And, when he asks, when he refers to the audience through Kadaspala as Gallan and Fisher, basically asking the audience, like, why, like, you tell me why didn't I paint this, and why didn't I paint that, and why do I choose to paint death and whatnot. That's for later, but I just want to bring up, like, this motif of different artists viewing the same thing differently, and all that being entangled into one thing, is a motif that keeps being brought up through Kharkanas. And how the authors and the poet and the artist's personal emotion and outlook on the story is imprinted throughout. To be frank with you, I'm not entirely sure where Steve ends and Gallan begins, and inversely. Like, I don't know how much of what Gallan writes Steve agrees with, because Gallan is very much a character. The narrator of Kharkanas is very much a character within the story. It's not a self-insert for Steve, like, say, Kadaspala is for Gallan, right? It's not just some character having thoughts. It's this character is thinking this because of this situation set up by this author, who also has an agenda, and they have to deliver that agenda. So, the way art is, the way the artist reflects on their art is a very nice lens through which to view Kharkanas as a whole. What does Kadaspala say about Gallan? What does Gallan say about Steve? What are we to take away from all of this? This is why I think this sort of reasoning is very important, and why I've been doing this series as a whole. Not just because I like Kadaspala, but because I think this offers a very nice and interesting way to look into the Kharkanas trilogy. All that out of the way, we're going to move on. Chapter 3. Which I have also used the Kadaspala quote, because I have, of course I have. Urisander, I see you now, and you frighten me to the core. So, quick history lesson. In Oscar Wilde's 1891 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which you should read, it's a great read, one of the main supporting characters is a painter infatuated with the titular character and artist of the titular picture, Basil Hallward. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Basil's borderline worship of Dorian leads to his painting containing too much of himself, and therefore Basil cannot allow himself to exhibit the portrait in any academy. Indeed, as the painter goes on, every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not the sitter. The sitter is merely the accident, the occasion. It is not he who is revealed by the painter. It is rather the painter who, on the colored canvas, reveals himself. The reason I will not exhibit this picture is that I am afraid that I have shown in it the secret of my own soul. Now, Dorian Gray and For the Darkness diverge very quickly beyond this point. I am not going to make the parallel. Maybe you could, if instead of Vath or Sander it was like a Cirque's portrait or something, but none of that here. What's important is that Kadaspala simultaneously agrees and somewhat disagrees with Basil, which is an interesting distinction, because I am quite sure that the picture of Dorian Gray has at least come to Erickson's attention at some point in his life. I have not asked, however. He does depict his own soul, as he does say, this portrait bore all of Kadaspala's wounds, but he simultaneously portrays an idealized form of the portrait's subject. I have painted a man worthy of being her husband, thereby making the sitter not merely the occasion. Indeed, Kadaspala's depiction of Vath Urisander reads like the thematic inverse of that of Dorian Gray. Rather than Urisander descending onto depravity with the knowledge that his acts shan't matter as they'll be reflected solely upon his portrait, it is rather the exact opposite. Urisander makes a point of sticking to his morals and refusing outside influence, for better and worse, usually worse, while the perception of the portrait's subject the perception of the portrait's subject matter changes throughout the books, from you have fashioned a true likeness to effectively casting away the identity imposed onto him by the portrait when Renard goes to kill him. Oh yeah, spoilers. The question that arises from the portrait, then, is this. How clearly did Kadaspala see, and how much does the portrait truly reflect the man that is Vath Urisander? That, alas, is a question for another time and another series, but the point I wish to highlight is this. Our first introduction to Father Light is through Kadaspala Enes. The artist is the man's first gauge of character, and what he has to say about him is scantily flattering. Gallan echoes Kadaspala's sentiments throughout the books, through Ursander's perception by different characters, all ultimately building up to the same picture. So, I want to get to this a bit, because the portrait of Ursander is something that gets brought up a lot with regards to his character. He brings it up a lot. It's one of the things that keep bugging him throughout the books. In chapter 2, in chapter 2 of Forge of Darkness, which was last time, I think. The last time. We went over how Kadaspala has fashioned a true likeness, and he had no idea he was so transparent. And as the book goes on, in chapter 7 of Fall of Light, I think, there's a scene with Sharinas and Ursander where the latter basically reminisces on Kadaspala and his actions of self-mutilation and how that reflects upon him in his portrait. Like, what is he trying to say? What is the point he's trying to make? Which we will get to that point later in this series, because there is a point being made. It's not just like he went mad with grief, like everyone's saying. There is a point being made. But, more to the point, how much the portrait reflects the man that is Vatha Ursander, and to what extent the portrait is an accurate depiction of the man, is something Gallan rehashes again and again through different lenses. You have Kadaspala, who thinks this man is an idealized form of who Ursander is, and if he tries to be like him, that's bad, because they will not see the cruel undertones. They will see only what they want to see. They will see the iron behind him. They will not see the expectations. They will not see the iron beneath. They will not see the cruelty. They will see a stern regard. They will see resolution. They will see resolve. And this more pertinently comes up with Renar in the very last chapter, when she claims that she herself has not seen the portrait, right? Because she pays little heed to art, especially the compromised kind. And there is a very interesting dialogue between the two about, is art all art then a compromise and whatnot? And I'm getting completely off topic, but the point I want to make is that this debate of to what extent does the portrait portray Vatha Ursander properly, and is this idealized, is Father Light Vatha Ursander, is a question that gets brought up a lot. I mean, metaphorically, not literally. Like, yeah, literally he is. Metaphorically, is he? This is not a question that's, new to Kharkanas. This is a question that's been brought up a lot, especially in the Book of the Fallen. Like, is Itkovian the Redeemer? Literally, yes. Metaphorically, is Anamander the Black-Winged Lord? Oftentimes, the answer is no. And so on and so forth. Like, with different deities, with different names. Names generally mean something in Malazan. So, a title like Father Light carrying with it such an expectation that's given unto the reader by Kadaspala's portrait and all that it portends, makes for a very interesting contrast. Rather than being a matter of faith. It's not like, oh, I believe this is the case, and this is how I have idealized the man, because I want him to be like this. Kadaspala doesn't. Father Ursander is not meant to be Father Light in this portrait. He's not supposed, this is not the man he's supposed to be. This is the man that can prevent a civil war, but it is not a good man. It's not a virtuous man. It's a cruel, unfeeling, uncaring man whose duty has overtaken him, has stripped him of his humanity. And you'll not be surprised to learn that this comes up again, especially in Fall of Light, with regards to how poets portray people, especially heroes. There's an excellent monologue by Kelaris, thinking about heroes of legend, and also from Gagamantratulas, and also from Renek, and also from Morfantal, about how heroes are portrayed in poetry, and heroes of legend, and why we should strive to be like them or not. Gallan constantly bitches about all of this. It's not something that's unique to Kadaspala and Forge of Darkness, or unique to Ursander. This is a motif that keeps being brought up. But this is our first introduction to this character. It's our first gauge of his character, who he is, what he wants. And personally, I think it's the most accurate. it's the most accurate depiction of the man that we see. It is an idealized form, and it sets into motion Sanders' character arc throughout the books. Because when we first meet him, he's stagnated completely, right? He's just poring over these Forlkan catalogs, trying to figure out what am I going to do with this? How is this going to work out? And by the very end of the book, he has decided, you know what, yeah, Mother Dark is right. If these guys can't behave, I'm not going to be the one that fixes this. This is not my mess. For better or for worse, Kadaspala sets forward Sanders' character arc. And I think it's really fascinating. So, to finish the monologue, Kadaspala laments that art is the language of the tormented, but the world is blind to that, forever blind. And indeed, if the rest of the Kharkanas trilogy is anything to go by, the world is blind to that language indeed. With that concludes chapter 3, and I have a small epilogue chapter-ish, which I have delightfully titled, Looking to the Future and Still Unheeded. Still unheeded, so to speak. So, I would just like to give a brief hint of what is to come when we next visit Kadaspala again. On the topic of artists going unheeded, he has an excellent monologue after finding a slaughter denier camp, which I can only relate verbatim. This painting is, in truth, a failure. And each time I paint this boy, I fail. I fail when you turn away. I fail when you walk past. I fail when you shout at me about the beautiful things of the world. And why didn't I paint those? I fail when you cease to care. And when you cease to care, we all fail. I fail, then, in order to welcome you to what we share. This face, this failure, it is recognition. But more on that next time, when we tackle Kadaspala's thoughts on faith and all it encompasses. For the time being, just keep in mind that Kadaspala is aware of the fact that he's bound to go unheeded, and his efforts are otherwise doomed to failure. And yet, still he tries, for as he already posited, art and painting is war. So, I'm not gonna overwhelm you with too much thoughts here, because I need to make 2 more episodes on this series, so I'm gonna keep it brief. And not try to rehash too much of what I've already said, but why I think Kadaspala is such an interesting character, beyond what I've already said, is I want to come back to what I said earlier about being Gallan's self-insert. He's not just a comfortable mask to don. He is more than the rest of his kind. He's more than the rest of his ilk. He doesn't simply take pity on the deniers. He doesn't simply pity them and protect them out of obligation. He lives among them. He loves with them. He is so, can't quite phrase that actually. It's a bit difficult because I don't remember exactly what goes on, and this is more material for the next chapter. Anyway, but what Kadaspala does and the arc he goes through in Forge of Darkness can be considered somewhat of a microcosm of all of the Dice storyline Full of Light. Because basically, what ends up happening is undeniable atrocities have been committed, and yet no one wants to heed it. Nobody wants to say the word that civil war is now upon us. No one wants to acknowledge what's in front of them. So, what makes Kadaspala so transcendental is that not only does he stare at it clear-eyed, unblinking, and say, yeah, you know what, this is happening, this is something we've done, this is something we need to deal with. He wants to bring that to everyone's attention. Just like Gallan's doing. Yeah? That's why I say this is a cautionary tale, because we like to bow our heads and just go on and say that everything's fine. And to quote Calor, nature wasn't much interested in grabbing those fools by the collar and shaking them until they realize what they've done wrong. No. Nature just wiped them off the map. And in truth, that's all they deserved. Such tales of caution are not unique to Kharkanas. I would say not a lot of Midnight Tides is a cautionary tale against dehumanization. I would say Reaper's Gale tackles similar thoughts. I would say To the Hounds is a very interesting exploration and cautionary tale against giving in to grief and all of its effects, like missing the forest for the trees. But Kharkanas is just more. And the way that it's explored is very interesting. It's not just Gallan showing you and telling you through someone like Rice Harat, right? Like, for example, in the Book of the Fallen, we have historians, because at the end of the day, what Kamentsod is trying to do is a historiography. He's trying to depict these events historically accurate as he can, as faithfully as he can. Obviously, he has an agenda. Obviously, that doesn't exactly work out, but that's his intention. That's his stated intention. Gallan's stated intention is different, and that's why he employs different characters. You don't get Rice Harat tell you how you should think, how you should feel. You get Prazak and Dathanar, you get Renar, you get Kadaspala, you get different characters, different professions, different individuals with which to explore this. The Tale of Caution is not simply against like moral degeneration or the denial of atrocities and whatnot. It's just Kharkanas, at the end of the day, is a tale about a people's suicide. And the first victim of said suicide is Kadaspala. And that's why I think this character deserves a series of his own. So on that upbeat note, I will close here. Thank you so very much for watching. This has been Smiley's After Hours, and I have been Lee, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.